Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Nancy Atto, General Manager of the ARC Agency. On behalf of our team and exhibiting clients, it's fantastic to have you join us for this keynote discussion, Sustainable Architecture, Who Has the Power? While sustainability as a model is close to perfect, I'm sure that you'll agree that in practice it is far from that. And this is what we'll be discussing in today's discussion, the messiness of making sustainability happen. Leading our discussion is columnist and author Dr. Elizabeth Farrelly, who is joined by industry thought leaders Professor Peter Stutchbury, Professor Elizabeth Mossop, Tom Forrest, Tina Perinotto, and Richard Francis Jones. Elizabeth is a Sydney-based author and columnist who is trained in architecture and philosophy and holds a PhD in urbanism from the University of Sydney. She's the former Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales Graduate School of Urbanism and a former City of Sydney Alderman and Councillor. A weekly columnist for the Sydney Morning Herald, she's the author of several books, including Glenmurcutt, Three Houses, Blubberland, The Dangers of Happiness, and her recently published book, Killing Sydney, The Fight for a City's Soul. So with that, I am delighted to welcome Elizabeth Farrelly and our panellists.
Good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank everybody for being part of this discussion entitled Sustainable Architecture, Who Has the Power? And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're all on, not least because of its sacred role, which clearly pertains to First Nations, but also to, I think, our relationship with the land. And in many ways, that's the discussion that we need to have today, is how to have more respect. Sustainability, I think, is rather an overused word, but of course, it's absolutely the issue of our times. And in the end, sustainability is all about power, political power, financial power, willpower, moral power, and persuasive power. This is especially true in the shaping of built form, which contributes enormously to climate change, but also to other forms of pollution and destruction across the planet. Architects and designers have offered many solutions to this issue, from ultra high-tech responses like the image that you see now on the left-hand side, which is the competition-winning zero carbon city centre designed by Lava Architects, a Sydney-based firm for Mazda in Abu Dhabi in 2009. And on the right, to a much more low-tech approach to sustainability, which is, in this case, Glenmurcutt's Kempsey House, 1975. The spectrum of possibilities is enormous, and these two images have been selected to suggest that great range of possibilities. But it is clear, nevertheless, that the time for shilly-shallying is over. So the questions facing us, I think, are, do we need regulation, more government control? Do we need less government control? Can architects and designers offer solutions, and will they do it unilaterally without being forced to? Is the real power in cities with the money, the corporations and the developers who by and large build our cities, or are there other ways that we can influence and bring about change? To chew over all of these questions, we have a panel of very distinguished practitioners in various fields. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our panelists. First, let me introduce Professor Peter Stutchbury, principal of the internationally renowned firm Peter Stutchbury Architecture. After graduating in Newcastle, Peter learned much from living with Indigenous peoples in Australia and Papua New Guinea and studying their lifestyles in Africa. With more than 150 buildings to his credit, he's received architecture awards, including the Australian Gold Medal in 2015 and the International RIBA Fellowship in 2016. Peter has taught in over 30 countries, holding chairs in Arizona, Colombia, Chile, South Africa, Bangladesh, as well as the Luis Barragan Chair in Mexico. He's a master within the Architecture Foundation Australia, which has engaged over 1,600 students from 82 countries. And in 2015, with Fernanda Cabral, he formed the PSA Foundation, a not-for-profit organization that does voluntary community building work in the favelas in Salvador, Brazil. Professor Elizabeth Mossop is Professor of Landscape Architecture and Dean of Design, Architecture and Building at UTS in Sydney, a founding principal of Spackman, Mossop and Michaels Landscape Architects based in Sydney, New Orleans and Detroit. She's held leadership positions at Harvard Graduate School of Design, at the Robert Reich School of Landscape Architecture at LSU and University of New South Wales. Her research and practice is concerned with landscape's role in urban revitalisation and resilient communities and cities in the face of climate change. Richard Francis Jones is one of our most prolific and distinguished architects, design director of FJMT. He studied at the University of Sydney, where he received the University Medal for Architecture, and at Columbia University in New York. Richard has won international architectural competitions, scores of design awards, and has taught architecture at several universities in Australia and abroad, as well as building half of the buildings being built in Sydney at the moment, as far as I can tell. He also writes well, having published theoretical papers in several journals, and was president of the AIA, New South Wales chapter, from 2001 to 2002. Richard is also a Life Fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects and an Honorary Fellow of the American Institute of Architects. Tina Perinotto is founder, managing editor and publisher of The Fifth Estate, which she founded in 2009. Publishing daily news as well as a weekly bulletin and numerous ebooks, The Fifth Estate has become hugely read and influential across the professions and more broadly throughout Australia, and is now Australia's leading publication for the sustainable property industry. Tina has worked as a journalist and columnist on the property desk of the Australian Financial Review, has been managing editor of Property Council Australia's magazine, and contributed to a number of leading business publications. And last but not least, Tom Forrest is CEO of the Urban Task Force Australia. He's held senior executive roles in the public service in key departments of Premier and Cabinet and transport portfolios, acting as Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor for various New South Wales ministers, including Ministers for Planning, Health and Olympics, as well as the Treasurer and the Premier. More recently, Tom worked with private sector clients in partnership with the former Director General of Planning, Sam Haddad, helping commercial and residential developers navigate an often complex regulatory landscape. In 2 years as leader of the Urban Task Force, he's become a strong voice for the property development and construction industry. So welcome to everybody, and thank you so much for making time to be here. So the first question really is quite general, we've had, we've had basics and neighbours, and we've had architects declare, and we all believe that something needs to be done about sustainability, but still our houses are the biggest in the world. They're increasingly unaffordable. They contribute something like 40%, depending on which figure you take, of greenhouse gases, buildings generally, and still our carbon footprint keeps increasing. Australia in particular seems quite bad at this. So the question, I'm going to ask Tom first, since I made him the last to be introduced, so he gets the first question. What is it that needs to change, and how much responsibility do you think developers, who do, after all, most of the building in the country, bear for what needs to change?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think at the outset, it's important to recognise that, like in all parts of society, there are a spectrum of developers. That it's wrong to characterise developers as a singular body. There are incredibly progressive, forward-thinking developers who lead the debate on sustainability. Back in the early days of Neighbours, and even before Neighbours, Lend-Lease were at the forefront of the development of the Neighbours initiative, something that's now considered to be commonplace. The the sorts of things you see more recently with Mirvac out at Newington at Sydney Olympic Park. Mirvac more recently also at Sydney Olympic Park producing a building which is entirely a unit apartment which is entirely constructed from recyclable products. These are cutting edge sorts of developments showing the way for the rest of the industry. I think the way that we've got to do it is for there to be a recognition that, in particular in Sydney, we're constrained by geography, we're constrained by ocean, by mountains, by national parks, and we have to think better about how it is that we develop our homes for our growing population. The population will grow for the next 20 years at least. It needs to do that to provide economic sustainability and to pay for the cost to government of the baby boomer generation. So the question is, how do we house that growing population? Do we house it by expanding more, as you say, taking up a greater footprint and therefore producing more environmental damage? Or do we alternatively look at increased density and better ways of housing the population without leaving the impact on the community? I think there's some of the things where the development industry has led the debate and in some cases followed the debate, and sometimes screaming.
Tom, I was just going to say, it is true that there are elements of the development industry that are indeed have strong sustainability values and are leading that, but that's not the whole story, is it? I mean, there's a whole wad of the development industry that really has little commitment or seems to demonstrate little commitment or interest to those objectives.
There's no doubt that the development industry will follow the rules that are in place by government. Those rules will be led by the legislators, they'll be led by architects, they'll be led by planners, they'll be led by social commentators. Ultimately, some will simply say, it's my job to make as much money for my company and to employ as many people as I can and to produce as many houses under those arrangements, and others will take the role of leading the debate. I think I just wanted to acknowledge that there is a spectrum. And within that spectrum, some will simply follow the rules. Not everyone will be a leader, Richard, just like every architect isn't necessarily a leader like you are.
But I'm wondering, what can we do to push this, actually, to push the development industry more towards the top? I mean, what about helping the community differentiate between these developers? Even like, we come from a very sporting culture in this country. We could have a kind of leaderboard, for example. We could have divisions where maybe developers get relegated and promoted. What about some of those ways in which we can help the community realize where it's being led and who to draw their allegiance to and where it's actually being threatened?
I'm loath to set up leaderboards. It's always going to be a subjective analysis.
I'm surprised.
When things come to architecture, there will be subjective analysis, and today's hero will be tomorrow's villain. It happens all the time. I think, though, we've had a similar sort of debate in relation to that following Mascot and Opal Towers with the building commissioner, where there's been a strong push supported by the Urban Task Force and the responsible parts of the development industry to clean out the lower level developers that are bringing down our name. In the same way as we support those efforts to clear out the bottom 10% that are bringing down the reputation of the development industry across the board, I would also support there being rewards for architects and acknowledgement of developers who work with high quality architects and produce high quality and sustainable results.
What about, this actually brings me to a question that I was going to ask, which is about the question of whether we should or could educate developers, whether the title should be protected in the way, the architect title is protected, and whether I know a lot of developers study construction or project management, but whether they should be obliged also to study sustainability and, design and beauty. I suppose this might be a question for Elizabeth Mossop. What do you think, Elizabeth? Can we educate developers? Could we require them to raise their game in that way?
I'm not certain that, that kind of regulation would produce the intended outcomes. But it raises this very interesting question that I think is inherent in what everybody is talking about, which is, from where are we going to get the leadership in this space? We culturally have grown up in an environment which used to have, I think, much stronger environmental regulation, and where, certainly at certain periods in our not so distant history, we did see much more leadership from government in this space around the environment and around the sort of the production of our cities. And I don't believe that we have that in the same way now. So, we're saying, there is a spectrum in all of these disciplines. There's a spectrum in architecture. We educate architects in social responsibility and sustainability. There's a spectrum with architects, just as there is with developers or with builders. But I'm very interested by the question of leadership. We're starting to see leadership around renewable energy coming out of the private sector for very, very sound economic reasons.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, I feel as though sort of this communication in this space, we have the technical answers, we have the design answers in many of these instances, but we do not have political will, we do not have the imperative. And I wonder whether we are at a tipping point where people, partly through the COVID experience, are a bit more conscious of questions of sustainability. We have a lot of young, very idealistic people entering all of these professions. I wonder if this is a moment of cultural transition in this space. And I do think, I believe, I guess I'm much more closely connected to the education in construction and all of the architectures. And I do feel that all of these disciplines have a responsibility in the creation of public good. And I wonder whether there is a way to change development culture. And I don't know, is it through further regulation or or education? We're starting to see internationally programs in sustainable real estate development. We're not seeing that so much here. But I wonder what it is. Who's going to take the leadership in this space?
Elizabeth, one thing I would contribute to the question of education, perhaps, is actually in our schools. And that goes across our whole community, our entire professional and development communities, is the drive actually from children and the questions they're asking their parents. It's really strong around sustainability, around equality, and around racism. These three key questions are driving, coming from our children, actually. And I think the obligation and the duty that puts on their parents, many of which will be developers or investors or in very diverse areas of our industry, I think that's where it will have an effect.
I often wonder whether you could teach urban design in primary schools, because it's not really very complicated.
It's not complicated,
Elizabeth, I think that demand will drive these changes. That as the generation that we're just talking about come through the education system, move into jobs and employment, and will look to buying their first home, they'll be looking for and paying a premium for the types of houses, the sustainable housing communities that they believe they want to live in. I think sometimes when we seek to regulate and we seek to determine what that might be, we actually miss the mark. There's endless examples of governments thinking they know what people are going to want in 10 years' time and getting it entirely wrong. The private sector will respond to the demand if the demand is solid and the demand is there.
Yes, well, I'd like to agree with you that we can trust the market. And in theory, that's plausible. But I've been out to Campbelltown recently and I've looked at what's being built out there. And the houses are roof to roof. There will never be any trees planted because there's no room for them. And in a part of Sydney where the days above 45 degrees are something like 17 a year and increasing, that means that people will be forced to sit inside with the air conditioning on. So the demand is clearly, that is clearly not happening. And maybe if we wait 50 years, maybe it'll happen then. But I think it's too late, honestly. So Tina, I see you nodding vigorously.
Oh, I totally agree with what you're saying. And I think Tom's raised some really interesting questions. I think the entire sustainability agenda has been one that's led from by the market, and it's been an opportunity for top companies to outperform and show how fantastic they are, Lend-Lease in particular. And it's been completely captured by this idea that it's a marketing opportunity to outperform and be best. And I think the property industry as a whole has been quite against any rules and regulations. And by the way, we can have rules and regulations, but if they're not policed, it doesn't really matter. We've got an example we did a story in WA, for instance, where for some reason, the culture there is to build double brick houses with no insulation. And they just, they really hate timber frames and insulate. They don't understand, don't want it. So they've got NATOs there, but have got an alternative path to proving that they can have the energy efficiency demanded by the law, by the way, and it comes out an equivalent of 2-star neighbours. And that's like a huge proportion of the houses being built over there. But in Australia, the rest of the country, it's no different. So, you've got this really strong anti-regulation movement, like there's something wrong with it. Like we didn't have that problem when it came to seatbelts in cars. People accepted it was a safety issue and that you have to do these things. I don't see what's wrong with it. And then I don't see what's wrong with actually making sure that people adhere to what the rules are. But constantly the pressure, Tom, is the opposite. To stop regulation. We know the stories. We hear them. We hear what goes on with the brilliant piece of legislation that came out a couple of years ago in New South Wales that everybody loved. Great industry engagement. It took ages to get through and we praised it to hell. And then between it going to the minister and ending up on the floor of Parliament House, someone had eviscerated it. Absolutely tore it to shreds. And we ran a headline, "Who done it?" because it was nothing like the thing that was agreed by the industry. So someone gets in there and tells them to get rid of all this stuff. That's what we see.
I completely agree. The role of government and regulation is absolutely pivotal. I think it's very difficult to find an example when things are left purely to the market that actually will address community concerns. It will address collective values. And in terms of sustainability, so much of that is connected with our investment structure, is connected with infrastructure development. It's got to drive models that get away from our suburban models, which in themselves are really bad. The market's unable to be strategic like that. And it is also unable to occupy that key leadership role that I think at a national level has been so weak. When it comes to regulation, then the challenge is the nature of that regulation, because often regulation is driven to keep the worst, from happening. Right? If it's not, however, drafted carefully, it will also inhibit innovation from the better parts of our sector.
It was government that drove the urban sprawl that we see today and that Elizabeth is complaining about. It was government
100 years ago
that invited people to Australia to pursue the American dream, getting out of small homes in high density locations in southern European nations and drove the urban sprawl and promised an American dream of the types of homes you saw in Happy Days. And it drove us into the burbs of Sydney. You can't always trust government to get it right. And if you do trust government, I'm asserting you will get it wrong and you'll push up costs along the way, because there's always a cost associated with regulation and compliance.
I'm not saying we can trust government. I'm actually saying we've got an absence of leadership in this issue, particularly at a national level. I'm just saying the role of government is critical.
Can I ask Peter, because this question of leadership is really interesting, and I, there's one way of leading from the top, which is we've been talking about sort of governments and developers. But I'm wondering, and you often see, if you're in these meetings, you see architects wheeled in for the design discussion and wheeled out for the money discussion. But Peter, do you have a view about whether architects are able to influence from, as it were, from below, from a position of not power, but more advocacy or persuasion?
Quite frankly, I don't think they can. I think it's just something like banging your head against a brick wall.
Yeah.
years and years on end. If I can just step back a bit too about the last discussion. If we were in India, 2 rooms and running water would be luxury. We're in Australia, so we need 17 rooms, 5 bathrooms and a big backyard. It's really interesting how our principles change over time. Like in the 60s, Australia was self-sufficient. And also the houses were less than, the average size house was 120 square metres, 140 square metres maximum. It seems to me like there's the whole issue of expectations which has changed, and that what the developer's done is purely met those expectations, and one has to question. I think it's only when the community as a whole is affected, that is by disease or by health or some other way, that there'll be remarkable change. I don't think remarkable change will start by an architect, at Richard's level or my level or anyone's level, saying stuff publicly. It goes in one ear, stays for a couple of weeks and goes out the other, in my opinion. It requires a concerted sort of force to change community or to change society in a good direction. So I think there are those incidents happening, and I would say they're incidents. Like there's a sustainable push in low-cost housing at the moment. There's sustainable push in high-rise buildings, but it's certainly not across the board, and it's certainly not philosophical. I think it's moment by moment. So until I think society feels the pain or expresses the pain, I don't think change will be radical. I think it will be momentary and sideways and incidental.
There is a movement, though, with large-scale developers. They're starting to get interested in sustainability, working with the Green Building Council, etc., like the big broad scale. But that's only just been about a year, 6 months since I started hearing that they're doing that.
Oh, it needs to be. I mean, I think they're meeting the requirements, and the requirements are mathematical requirements or scientific requirements. They're not meeting the philosophy of it, and so you're not seeing philosophical shifts in the way that people look at things. And in the past, a village or a city wouldn't survive unless it was sustainable. It just couldn't manage itself. It would either shut down and move on, like the villages in Africa and New Guinea and etc., or it would need to reinvent itself at some stage. We survive purely because we're overserviced. We've just got so much of everything, and I don't think it's not sustainable. It's not manageable.
What about a model like Nightingale, which has been so successful in Melbourne?
I think that's a terrific model because it actually puts the onus on the individuals. I think it's a really good way of making people aware. I mean, if we could do that in public housing generally, that would be wonderful because people become far more aware far more quickly. But I look at some developers, and my cousin is well up in Lend-Lease, and I was listening to him talk 3 weeks ago. And unfortunately, even though there's a direction which is about sustainable principles, at the end of the day, the final direction is about profit. And whilst profit is paramount in the developer's psyche and not social awareness, then things aren't going to shift as quickly as they should. I mean, the reality is things need to shift, like yesterday.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, I might just briefly respond to that. I think that sustainability has to be triple bottom line. If it's not economically sustainable, then it's not going to happen. You can wish all you like for environmental and social sustainability, but unless the government's going to build it, if it's not going to be profitable, then it's not going to happen. It's not a question of extravagant margins. It's the question of the margin required to get the bank to lend you the money. If you can't show that, and that is commensurate with risk. Risk can be raised or lowered. It can be raised by changing government regulation, by increasing requirements. It can be by the extension of time, by the predictability of the system. It can be lowered by making it more predictable system, by encouraging innovative development. It can be lowered in lots of different ways. But when you just are a builder, if you're just building something, your margins relatively low. It's between 3 and 5, 3 and 6%. That's the margin for the profit on construction only.
I don't think anyone's
a developer, then the margin is significantly increased. If you can't demonstrate a profit, you don't get the funding, and it just doesn't happen. So you can wish all you like. You can sit there and snigger at Campbelltown.
Tom, I think in a way we're potentially kind of missing where the real problem is here. And if you look towards the development industry, if you look towards government, if you look towards regulation, but I think what Peter's hinting at here is actually the kind of paradoxical urgency around this issue. Because on the one hand, this is the most urgent issue we face on the planet, right? It couldn't be more urgent, right? It is so urgent. On the other hand, it's not urgent at all. I can't see it. It's not affecting me. Right? And, it's a problem because in the daily lives of Australians and of course, recognising the very different community issues that we all face. But, if you face issues of, have I got a job, right? Am I going to get a job? Where am I going to live? How do I get the kids educated? How do I care for my aged parents, right? In that run of problems that are very urgent, let alone a virus, where does climate change rest? I can't see it. It's like it's going to not be until that tidal wave is almost hitting us, till we actually see it on the horizon, and then it'll be too late. So this is a very diffused issue. It's an urgent issue, but it's hard to see. And that is why we're struggling with it as an entire community, both the government, both private, public sector. It's so difficult.
But what I wonder, if you think about architecture as a discipline, as being central in this conversation, I wish architects were involved in, a greater proportion of our buildings. If you think about the influence of something like Nightingale, that is one of the first new models that we have seen in Australia for the production of urban development.
And it was architect-led. Yeah.
Architect-led. What architects bring to this problem is this synthetic, creative problem-solving ability, but also this obsession with future states. And if only we could see more of that creativity applied to less conventional ways of trying to solve this problem, because we can't solve it by doing a better version of what we're doing now. Lend-Lease is not going to solve climate change by making a commercial office tower a smidgy bit more sustainable. We really need some game-changing, inspirational ideas in this space. Maybe architects are not effective in the political realm, but it's this production of ideas and this generation of solutions is right at the heart of this discipline. We talk about it endlessly at university, and somehow, by and large, in the profession, it gradually disperses. But this has got to be a moment of reinvention, and it's sort of silly to think that one profession solves it or doesn't solve it. But where is the inventiveness in this space? The challenges are around putting together, all the conventional things about architecture with what is available to us in new technologies and the mastery of these technologies to actually solve some of these problems in new ways. And I don't know who is better positioned to take this kind of intellectual leadership in this space.
It seems to me that's not just about, just to come back to you, Tina, but this takes me to the interesting question, because it's not just ideas that architects produce, and it's not just problem solving. What they do that nobody else does is draw. And that has huge persuasive power for the public, because it means that surely that architects are capable actually of imagineering a future for us and showing us what it will look like. And it seems to me that Nightingale was successful because it looks so good. It just is so chic and sexy and interesting and kind of cool. So people are prepared to live next to a railway line because it's so lovely as a design. So that, it seems to me, that puts beauty at a pivotal position in the sustainability debate because it's seductive. And I wonder, where are architects? Why aren't they drawing the future for us?
The other interesting thing about Nightingale is it has massive social ambition.
Yes.
You know, that's the other thing that model has sort of resurrected, I think, within the discipline. You know, questions of carbon economies and performance, again, with ideas about quality of life, but also this massive social ambition to really think about better ways of living and better ways of supporting communities.
Well, that's architecture as a form of virtue signaling, isn't it? It's like this.
Why not?
Yeah, absolutely. Why not?
I would like just to say that what Nightingale did for me, and I think that goes back to what Tom was saying, funnily enough, and I think there's a point. What Nightingale did is it seized control of the finance. And this was the most radical and imaginative thing I have ever seen. And that's why I was so excited, because architects are the most creative, wonderful people. They do imagine the future. They get me excited when I speak to them. I think they're fantastic. And then they go silent on the public stage. That's one thing.
Yes.
The other thing is that here, it was an architect that said to me, it wasn't actually Nightingale, it was somebody else. Ivan Ridjovic from Melbourne is an architect down there. And he said, what if we took control of the power, the financial power that we give developers for nothing by buying off the plan? We give them the deposit that they then go to the bank and get a huge loan on the basis of. And then, by the way, you have to take the apartment however it comes. They can make it smaller or bigger. They can actually take away all the quality, but that's all in the contract. You've got to accept it. Pretty much. And then, you know, when it goes wrong, it's terrible. But they seize control of the finance. And you do have to have the three elements together in sustainability. You've got to run the funds. And they struggled to get that first project up, and they begged me not to write that story when I had it, because they said the banks are absolutely, they will run a mile. They're terrified. They want us to say that we should make 22 to 25% profit, but we only want to make 15. And they think that's crazy, but we have to convince them. And now they've got ANZ, they've got all these impact investors, they've actually got financiers to become radical. And we are starting to get that. You know, and so there is a model that can be made, but, you know, it's always a question of time, how much time we've got to influence people. The people going through the apartments now looking at Nightingale in the open days are other developers. They've influenced, you know, Milieu, Assemble, you know, all those, you know, hip versus hype. There's radical, wonderful new developers that say to Jeremy McLeod, you know, well, can you design our stuff for us? But, you know, we're not going to do your financial model. We want 25% profit, but, you know, make it look the same. So that's something. But it's actually, we've got the power of as consumers, if we could work with architects, they could be more outspoken to actually change the way things are done. That's my
you know, it's great. It's I think I'm going to lean over to Peter at this point, because I'm totally on board with all of that, and it is an extraordinary influence and contribution, I think, that architects can make. However, what I would say is, if we're really concerned about this issue beyond the surface, you know, three things we can do, and sorry, Tom, this is going to go to government regulation, is going to be saying only electric cars in our streets, right, yes, by 2025, right? And you can do that. Other countries are doing it. We could say it. We're hopeless on that issue. We can say only green power, right, in our projects, and carbon positive, right? And notwithstanding all the great intentions of the very finest people in the development community, and there are, I agree with Tom, there are outstanding people there, all the great aspirations and the cultural creativity of architects and other designers, will then turn that into something pretty amazing. But without that, that's a way in which you will address the scale of the issue. Right?
And isn't that kind of regulation, helpful for developers in a way, because it sort of makes a level playing field. So if they've all got to comply with, you know, those regulations, those simple rules, then surely it is beneficial, because then they're still competing with each other in the same way.
I think it's too narrow to think in terms of 3 prescriptive elements that might change the world. I think.
Oh, come on,
Oh,
Tom.
no, I don't.
It's a webinar, you know, we've got
Just
to.
another input.
I think.
And actually, they would.
You've got to drive it. You've got to you got to make it understandable, this issue. You know, you've got to, if we're going to get the community around this thing, right, we've got to drive really simple things. They'll make a massive difference if we were to do that.
I think you need to think big picture. Things like the establishment of an emissions trading scheme, which builds in a price incentive for improved sustainability, and then everything else flows. If the Greens hadn't knocked that off when it was available to us, we wouldn't have had Tony Abbott at the time. We would be a long, long way down the track to the very things that Richard's talking about. But
the coal industry would have thought of something else, trust me.
Yeah.
No, an emissions trading scheme would well, I can't predict. I genuinely fear that without that overall price incentive to move in this direction, it would have taken the whole private sector in all the forms, including the development construction industry. There would have been a price imperative to produce something better. And that's we think we need to look big picture, and that's where we need to look to government to establish a system that takes on board the very things that Richard was raising, that Peter was raising, the need to have something which drives the private sector to work with the quality architects to deliver a better outcome, and therefore deliver a triple bottom line, a better social outcome, a better environmental outcome, driven by a price signal, which means that developers can continue to make profit.
Just to quickly add, I think a strong playing field, like Richard is suggesting, is a great idea. An even playing field is terrific because it eliminates the grey areas. And if I can just support Elizabeth with her comments, why is it the most innovative people in our culture are not on the major boards of Sydney and Australian companies? You know, like influencing decision-making. We've got Richard, are you on any boards? We're certainly not, and haven't been. Richard's one of the most innovative thinkers, regardless of architect or not. And that fascinates me, that architects are never engaged to be influential on boards that fundamentally change the culture of the country, like BHP, like those sort of things, like ANZ. Why aren't innovative thinkers on those boards that can help those people to see the problems?
That is a challenge. That is such a challenge, I think, for architects and other creative people, because what that represents, because boards are wall-to-wall accountants and lawyers, and a little sprinkling of other people.
Not much.
Not much. And because we have failed conclusively to communicate the value of what we bring to these conversations. And I think, again, this is a challenge that we have got to be so much more articulate about how valuable this kind of thinking is. We've got to wrestle design thinking away from the accounting firms and somehow try to represent this valuable role around creativity and innovation. As a society, we do not value it. Everyone is terrified of these new ideas, and yet that is our stock in trade. And we can contribute so much in terms of strategic thinking and innovative problem solving, and this whole magic power about being able to think into the future.
And probably save them a lot of money too.
What does everyone think about the role of planning in all this? I mean, Tom, do you think that there should be no planning? There seems to be a push from developers generally to deregulate. So is the ideal position to have no planning at all, or what would be the role for planning in your view?
No, certainly not. I certainly wouldn't be advocating for no planning at all. I think sensible separation of industrial from heavy industrial, from light industrial, from commercial to residential, and is all entirely sensible. What I'd like to see is a planning system that allows for merit-based flexibility. So you have essentially, you can have a more code-based system, which is more prescriptive, but if you can demonstrate according to merit that you can produce a better outcome, which still meets the objectives of the particular zoning of the area, then you can work with quality architects to come up with a site-specific case for not complying with the code. At the moment, we've tended as a planning system to go towards code only, tick a box, not producing great outcomes. I don't think that's great for architects. I don't think it's great for the outcome for the community. And that's where I'd like to see a change. So bring back the merit-based assessment is what I would say.
Doesn't that mean there's no zoning? If you're saying you can have spot rezoning, that means there is no zoning, because as soon as you're saying you can rezone on merit, then it's just taking the minister to lunch, isn't it?
Absolutely not. And now it's the case that the ministers don't make the decisions on those matters. The regional panel,
the so-called independent panel. Yeah.
And if it were the case that we could have better quality representatives and decision makers on those panels, then I'd be all for that. But the fact is, we're a long way from the scenario that you just painted. Now ICAC is active, and every developer knows it.
Nevertheless, spot rezoning does undermine everything about zoning, whether you're doing it through state significant development requirements or unsolicited bids. However you package that, it still undermines the intention of zoning, which is this area is for that thing. So it seems to me that those things are contradictory. I don't know. What does everyone else think about this?
The answer to that is circumstances change. The world changes, demand changes.
But then don't you change the rules rather than just change it?
You don't change the rules. You just demonstrate that there needs to be a merit-based case. If there's no merit-based case, you don't get the change.
You break the rules.
If there is a merit-based case and you're still meeting the objectives, then there's a case for that to be considered. I think this whole idea that merit-based assessment means throw the baby out with the bathwater is just wrong.
What do you think, Richard?
Isn't merit shifting all the time?
Yeah.
And therefore you get a city that has no foundation. I mean, it seems that the cities these days, particularly in young countries, have no respect for the land that they're built on. They're just built according to demand. Whereas if they had been built according to land, which most of the great cities like London and Paris were, then they'd be a lot more responsible to the land and a lot more planned to the land as well. And in Japan, you can't move some of these homegrown industries out of an area because residential is more popular. It's compulsory to leave them there because they're part of the grain of that town or that city. And I think we've got no respect for that sort of understanding, that cultural understanding. And as a consequence, we demolish industrial places and rebuild them in residential and hope that they're going to work. I think the industrial, light industrial in particular, is just as important as we're finding now. We may not be reliant on other countries as we are. In the 60s, we weren't reliant on any other countries.
Mm.
So, I think it can't be piecemeal like that on its merit. I think it's got to be planned.
I think planning is really important. It's and maybe we're focusing too much just on the cities. And certainly in this city, we have an incredibly highly developed planning environment. You have very strong relationships and partnerships between private and public sector that are actually producing pretty amazing outcomes, including, we'll very soon be getting to large buildings in our cities actually built predominantly from timber, just talking about sustainably sourced materials and embodied energy. But a bigger issue in a way is outside our cities. And I think in a sense, Peter, you're hinting at that. It's the massive kind of unmediated exploitation of the land that's unsupported by adequate social and transport infrastructure. And it requires planning and public investment to make this work. And that is actually going to fuel the kind of private sector to also deliver better outcomes, and then the other performance regulations put across it. So I think planning is absolutely pivotal and really decisive, and makes a huge difference. These big moves for our future is what's going to make a change way beyond efforts that we're talking about in a more localized way. Our cities, are growing and developing, are maturing. There's wins and loses, but the bigger issue is outside the cities.
I think planners, they're even more reticent than architects to speak up in public. And it's just one of those professions that has been continually, and I agree with everyone, what people are saying, planning is the most important thing of all and should be really, really strong. And it used to be really strong, but it's been progressively degraded by this pressure of the market and this, incredible ideology that puts the market and consumer demand, supposed consumer demand first, but it's not a real consumer demand. Consumers will choose from what's available. And when they go out to, Happy Valley, sales land to choose their next house, are they being offered a tiny house or a modest sized house? They're being offered between Plan A and Plan B McMansion. It's not a real choice. And that's why I think we need to actually have really strong government and rules and sort of not be afraid of it. And, we've got to change the ideology, to allow that to happen, in my view.
That problem, Tina, I think, goes where you have a local interest that actually works against a broader strategic community interest. And that sets up a kind of paralysis in planning and in government, and then it entrenches kind of a narrow band of interest. And really it kind of revolves around the whole concept of private property ownership, which ultimately I think will need to be rethought in this country.
Absolutely.
And also much of the problem sort of arises in the how space with planning. And I think a whole lot of the lack of clarity and the ability to bend the rules is one of the things that builds in a whole lot of incredibly unproductive time and complexity. Whereas I feel as though if it were stronger and simpler, it would be much more robust and there would be a massive financial benefit.
Huge amount of wasted emotion and time in community warfare of one kind or another.
That's another issue.
Look, I'd like to talk about this community thing a bit, but perhaps we've got a chance to do that with the questions. I think we've come well past probably the end of our time. But look, I'd like to say thank you so much to everybody. And we'll see you in the next session, the Q&A session, which will start shortly. Thank you so much.